Hello, it's me again. Hello, guys, how are you? Hope you're doing well. I'm happy I can meet you again. As you can see, I feel a lot more comfortable with the recording classes. Soon I'm going to be a YouTuber and embarrass all of you. So we're going to go on to chapter 9 in our economics, right? And we're going to talk about something very interesting that is really related to our reality today, which is labor and wages. Have you stopped to think about it in this pandemic? Many people have had cuts in their salaries. We've had people who are getting laid off. Companies are having a hard time, actually, firms paying their employees. So where is the line of what we can and we can't do? And these laws that protect us nowadays, how long have they existed, and why are they're so important to us? Okay, so as we go, we're going to be talking. We're going to start with actually lesson 1. Yeah, so the whole chapter is labor and wages, but lesson 1 is the labor movement. How did the labor movement exactly start, and when did it start, guys? Sometimes we think that the union, the labor movement, is something that, it only began in 50 or 1960 or 80. It has its roots, especially in the USA, as strange as it may seem. Before you read this, actually the whole unit, business and labor, I really hope you have watched this video, gender and wage inequality. It's a very nice video, give you some good information. There's also another video in chapter 9, which is related to unions and strikes. I think you would learn a lot from it. So chapter 9, labor and wages, okay? We're talking about wages, the development of labor, of union. What features of the modern labor industry are the result of union action? This is one of your assignments, and I think this lesson will help you out a little. So what do we have? What are the features of union action, right? These are the most important ones, okay? What did the union give us or fight for? Yeah, weekends off from work, our 8-hour workday shift. We have basic enforced safety measurements at the workplace, okay? So the work cannot really hurt us. We have the right to a paid vacation or sick days in case I get sick. My company needs to pay me. We have days off for national holidays. We have extra pay for working overtime. And we have a minimum wage guarantee. So no employee can pay you less than that. If I'm not mistaken, nowadays in Brazil, it's around 1,000 reais a month. So for what purposes did early unions form? Why did they start? When was the beginning? So today, only one, we're talking about the USA, okay? Let's go a little bit to the United States. In the US, only 1 out of every 9 working Americans is a member of a labor union. It's a very low number. Even so, unions are very important because they played a major historical role in helping to create the legislation that affects our pay and working conditions today. So even though only 1 in 9 Americans are a member of a labor union, unions, they continue to be very important. As we are reading throughout this lesson, try to think about the sequence of events that gave the laborers the benefits that are still present nowadays. They are benefits that we have, although we did not fight for them. We're going to go back to Colonial Times from the Colonial Times to the 1930s, okay? So look at this. Isn't this interesting? In 1778, printers in New York City, they joined together to demand higher pay. They came together, okay, want higher wages. It was the first attempt, actually, to organize labor in America in 1778, a long time ago. Before long, unions of shoemakers, carpenters, and tailors, remember tailors are the people who sew your clothes, they developed. Each one of them was hoping to negotiate agreements that covered how many hours a person works, the pay, and working conditions, which is really important. While only a small fraction of all workers, a very small fraction of the workers belong to unions, most unions were made of skilled workers. So the unions, basically, they had a select public, okay? The people who belong to the unions, they have a skill, a writer, a journalist, and they also possessed strong bargaining power. So up until the 1820s, most of America's workforce was made up of farmers, okay? Most of them. Small business owners and self-employed. Soon the immigrants began to arrive in the United States. They started arriving in great numbers. And the immigrants provided a supply of cheap, unskilled labor. So the people could pay them a low salary. They did not have a special skill, okay? And they started posing a threat to the unions. The unions at that time were working to preserve the existing wage and labor standards. But things were changing. In addition, the public opinion at that time was against the union activity. All over the country, actually. Some parts of the country, it was even banned. They even banned labor unions. Labor organizers were viewed as troublemakers, and many workers believed that they could better negotiate with the employer on a one-to-one basis. So they preferred to negotiate with their boss instead of going to union labor. This was in 1820. Our story goes far. Then we had the Civil War, which led to higher prices and a greater demand for goods and services. So the United States, they went through the Civil War. They came out of it how? They had higher prices and a great demand for goods and services. Manufacturing expanded and the farm population declined. Hourly workers in industrial jobs, so they made up about 1/4 of the country's working population. So the industrial job population was really growing. Working conditions in some industries were very difficult. They were horrible, actually. And they had hostile attitudes toward unions, right? But then, after the Civil War, they started to soften a little by little, okay, towards union. They started actually communicating a little. And many of the cultural and linguistic differences between the immigrants, remember these immigrants, they came from different countries and they were working in horrible, horrible conditions in a country where it did not have a positive attitude towards unions. So they began to soften a little because they saw that something good could come out of this. And their differences, they set aside, okay, and they began actually to fade. And the labor force actually made them feel more unified. So from here, we're going to go to types of unions. What types of unions do I have? In the industrial post-Civil War period, we had two main types of labor unions, which dominated. The first was the craft or trade union. What is the craft or trade union? It's the same with different names, okay? It's an association of skilled workers. A skilled worker who performed the same kind of work. One of the most famous was the Cigar Makers Union, which was founded by a union leader, Samuel Gompers. And he's an example of this type of union, okay? We had the Printers Union, which is considered the craft or trade union. We have the electricians, the carpenters, and so on. Remember here, they are skilled people. They have a special skill. Okay, and they perform the same type of work. This is my craft or trade union. The second type of union, which started really growing after the Civil War, was the industrial union, which is an association of all workers in the same industry. It doesn't matter what job they have, okay, regardless of the job each individual worker performed. The development of basic mass production industries, such as steel and textiles, it gave the opportunity to organize this kind of union. So remember, the industrial part of the United States was growing. Because of many workers in these industries, they were unskilled. They were not carpenters or writers. And they could not join the trade union, which required a skilled person. So they organized as industrial unions instead. Okay, we have two types of union here. Let's see one of those most important ones here. We have the oil, gas, industrial union, which is an example of an industrial union. It includes workers engaged in what? oil, gas, and geothermal fields, refineries, and processing facilities. We also have the motor transport workers in the industrial union. Is an example, though. It represents all workers engaged in hauling freight and passengers by truck, bus, and cab. So these people actually started getting, they were being represented in the industrial union. So what is the main difference between craft and trade unions? I wrote this word wrong, and I'm going to fix it. What is the difference? Remember, craft or trade are associations of skilled workers. They do the same kind of job. Industrial unions are associations of all the workers in the same industry. It doesn't matter what kind of job they are doing. They are represented by the industrial unions. What are the union activities? Okay, so they try to help workers. How? By negotiating higher pay, by fighting for job securities, and better hours and working conditions. Remember, in those days, there wasn't the set 8 hour a day, okay? So if an agreement was not reached between the workers and between the employees and the employers, the workers would strike, which means they refused to work until certain demands were met. The unions also pressured employers by having the striking workers picket. What is picket? Is when you make a parade in front of the employer's business carrying signs about the dispute, okay? Saying what you want from this company. The signs can ask other workers not to seek jobs. Like if I am on strike, I ask you not to get my job with the company. Or they might ask customers and suppliers to show union support by taking their business away. So if a striking and picketing did not force a settlement of the dispute, a union would usually organize a boycott. It's a mass refusal to buy products from targeted employers or companies. When a boycott was effective, it hurt the company's business because they would lose customers. Of course, we had the employer resistance. I mean, we had the union here fighting, helping the workers go on strike, picket, and if this doesn't work, they started boycotting the companies. Were the employers happy with this? Of course not. They were resistant. They resented, they hated the strikes, the pickets, and the boycotts. So they fought unions in a number of ways. Sometimes the owners called for a lockout. What is a lockout? A lockout is a refusal to let employees work until they agreed to management demands. So if I'm the boss, I call for a lockout. You are forbidden to work until you do as I say. Lockouts once they were very rare, but they have been increasingly used by management. In 2011, actually, the National Football League locked its players out for like 130 days. So it's still used nowadays. In the same year, the National Baseball Association locked its players out for 161 days. The New York City Opera even locked out its singers and orchestra briefly in 2012. So it's not something that's not used anymore. At other times, management has responded to a strike or the threat of a strike by hiring all new workers to replace those on strike. So some owners even set up a company unions. What's a company union? It's a union organized and supported or run by the employers. Okay? This is my company unions. From this, we had a famous case, which is called the Ludlow Massacre. What was the Ludlow Massacre? The United Mine Workers of America, they had organized a strike against a coal mining company, which is owned by John D. Rockefeller. I think you've heard this last name. And they were demanding better pay and working conditions. So what did the company do? They forced the workers out of company-owned homes because the company had the homes and the workers, they lived in them. The miners lived in these homes with their families while they were working. But the company forced them out, so they moved into the tents which were set up by the union. In those days, at that time, the strike actually was expected to end after a few days, but it lasted 14 months. There were times that ugly fights broke out between striking miners and the company guards. The mining company also hired a private detective agency, and they received assistance from the Colorado National Guard. One of the most famous fights was in spring 1914, which became an all-day battle and it ended up in a devastating fire. And at the end of that day, dozens of people were killed, including 2 women and 11 children. So the violence of that day quickly called the Ludlow Massacre. And it sparked rioting in other coal mining communities. So all coal mining communities, they started striking as well and rioting. This resulted in a conflict that took the life of 200 people. It was really a bad episode. And what was the attitude of the courts? How was the justice facing this? Throughout this period, the courts had an unfavorable attitude toward unions. They did not see the union with good eyes. Under English common law, unions were considered conspiracies against business, and they were prosecuted in the United States. So even the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, it aimed mainly at curbing monopolies. It was used to keep labor in line. So they did not see the union with good eyes, and they were fighting against it. An example of this is in 1902, when the United Hatters Union called, so they were making hats, okay? And they called a strike against Dunbury, Connecticut. Okay, it's a hat manufacturer. And the hat manufacturer had rejected the demand from the laborers and the union. So what did the union do? They decided to apply some pressure on the stores so they would not stock hats made by Dunbury firm. What did the hat manufacturer do in response? Charging a conspiracy in restraint to the Supreme Court. So they went to the Supreme Court. Okay, they filed a damage suit. And this damage suit went such a long way, it ended in the Supreme Court. And what happened when this suit went to the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court ruled that the union had organized an illegal boycott in restraint of trade, thereby dealing a severe blow to organized labor. The union at this point, they lost because the Supreme Court understood that they had damaged the company. The Dunbury Hatters case and several other cases actually pushed organized laborers to call for relief. So the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 helped to remedy the threat to unions. So they were weak after this, but then the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, they helped to remedy the threat to unions by expressly exempting labor unions from prosecution under the Sherman Act. So it's said here that they will not be prosecuted anymore for going on strikes. And how did the unions change from the beginning in the 18th century through the early part of the 20th century? Just to make sure you guys are with me. Remember, the first union was in 1778. It was small and local, but the workers' response to poor working conditions and pay was the demand throughout the period. So the difficult working conditions during the Civil War, see, we're going forward, were followed by the rise of the craft and trade unions. It's what happened. Remember, the craft and the trade unions, they were for skilled workers. And after that, after the Civil War, we had the early industrial unions organizing strikes and picket lines. We also need to take into consideration the government's role in all of this. Remember, the government, up to this point, they did not see the unions with a positive attitude. So labor since the 1930s. Okay. Have labor laws since the 1930s strengthened or weakened the union movement, and why? Let's continue. I'm sure all of you have heard of the Great Depression. It was the worst period of economic decline in the United States, actually. It began with the collapse of the stock market in the October of 1929. It basically lasted actually 10 years until 1939. And what happened at those times? 1 in 4 workers was without a job. That's a huge number. And those that kept their jobs, they saw pay cuts. So in 1929, the average hourly manufacturing wage was 55 cents, for you to have an idea. Okay? By 1933, it went down to 5 cents in some areas. So from 55 cents an hour to 5 cents is a huge cut. The Great Depression brought misery to millions of people, but it kind of changed their attitudes toward the labor movement. Common problems united factory workers, and union promoters renewed their efforts to organize workers. So here the union is becoming strong again after the Great Depression. A pro-union legislation, sorry, I was reading in Portuguese. The new legislation soon aided labor. They helped labor, okay? They prevented, actually it was the Norris-LaGuardia Act of 1932, which prevented federal courts from issuing ruling against unions engaged in peaceful striking, picketing, or boycotts. What does this mean? They forced the companies to negotiate directly with the unions during labor disputes. So the companies could not go to the Supreme Court anymore, okay? The unions had the right to fight for the workers. The National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act of 1935, established the right of unions to have collective bargaining. It also created the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, giving it the power to police unfair labor practices. The NLRB also could oversee, check, and certify union election results. If a fair election resulted in a union as the employee's bargaining agent, employers had to recognize and negotiate with it. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, it applied to business that engaged in interstate commerce. What is this? The law set the first minimum wage and established time and a half pay for overtime. So people now had a minimum wage, how much time you can, how much money you can get, the minimum, and you would get a half pay if you do overtime. By 1940, it was defined as more than 40 hours per week. The act also prohibited oppressive child labor. So until 1940, we had children working in horrible conditions. It defined as any labor for a child under 16 and work that is hazardous to health of a child under 18. So here, children were forbidden from oppressive child labor. The anti-union backlash. Okay, so the union movement had grown strong by the end of the World War II. But then public opinion, it shifted again. Some people, they feared, they were afraid, oh my God, the communists had secretly entered the unions. And other people were concerned over production losses due to the increased number of strikes. So you had these two groups of people, a group which is afraid of the interference of the communists. They believed that the communists were actually entering the unions, it's their belief. And others were actually worried about production losses. There were too many strikes, and this was not good for business. So people began to think that management, not labor, was the victim. So now it's the employer and not the employee. Growing anti-union feelings led to the Labor Management Relation Act, 1947. The act had a tough anti-union provision known as Section 14. What is Section 14? It allows individual states to pass right-to-work law. What is a pass-to-right-to-work law? A right-to-work law is a state law making it illegal to force workers to join a union as a condition of employment. So from 1947 and up, a worker he did not have to join a union and able to work. And this was given to each state separately, okay? If a state does not have a right-to-work law, then new workers may be required to join an existing union as a condition of employment. If a state has a right-to-work law, then new hires can decide for themselves. The worker can decide whether or not they want to change, they want to join a union. You have a picture here of the United States, where the states that have the right to work laws. You see, we have many states here, including Florida, where they do not, you do not have to belong to a union and able to work. We have Texas, South Carolina, North Carolina. We have Tennessee. So you see, it's a big chunk of the United States. Continue. Let's go. So the legislation was aimed at stopping criminal influences. What's a criminal influence? That had begun to emerge in the labor movement. So like every movement that we have, there's always something negative that happens, okay? The most important law was the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act. This act, what did it do? It required unions to file regular financial reports with the government because the union receives a lot of money. It also limited the amount of money union officials could borrow from the union. So here, they were setting limits for the union because the workers pay a fee to the union and they had a lot of money. We have the AFL and the CIO. What is AFL? The American Federation of Labor. When did it begin? In 1886, it was an organization of craft or trade union, remember, for skilled workers. And then they added several industrial unions to this group, okay? However, the craft and industrial unions, they did not always agree. So 8 of the industrial unions, they formed a separate group headed by John L. Lewis, which was the president of the United Mine Workers of America. The AFL and Lewis, they did not get along. They did not have a good relationship. So Lewis and his industrial unions were expelled from the group in 1935. And they formed the Congress of Industrial Organization, which is the CIO. The CIO quickly organized unions in industries that had not been unionized before, such as the steel and automobile industries. So these ones did not have a union by then, and they started having a union in 1935, thanks to the CIO. By the 1940s, the CIO had nearly 7 million members. It was growing strong. As the CIO grew stronger, it began to challenge the dominance of the AFL, of course. So in 1955, the AFL and the CIO, they joined together to form the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. By 2005, of course, there was a disagreement over the best way to spend union funds, which is the money, and it resulted in a breakup of the AFL and CIO. The breakaway unions formed the rival Change to Win coalition. This split did not seem to weaken the political influence of organized labor. So the remaining AFL and CIO unions, they focused their efforts on lobbying politicians. We also have independent unions, although the AFL and the CIO and the Change to Win coalition, there are 3 now, are still major forces in the United States. Other unions are also as important in the labor development movement. Many of these unions, we say they are independent unions that do not belong to either the AFL, the CIO, or the Challenge to Win coalition, such as we have the Major League Baseball Player Association, the Fraternal Order of Police, and the U.S. Airline Pilots Association. So these ones are independent. Organized labor today. How do the types of union arrangements differ? We have different types of union. Unionized, so the workers, what do? They participate in several kinds of union arrangements. They're very different. And union participation in the labor force, it varies actually. It's very different. For example, here we have the closed shop. What is the closed shop union? It's an arrangement in which where workers must join a union before they are hired. In a closed shop, it's illegal for any company to hire me if I do not join a union. We have the union shop. It's where workers, they must join a union after being hired. So here I need to join a union before I am hired. And in a union shop, I need to join a union after I am hired. And I need to remain a member of this union as long as I hold my job. Then we have the modified union shop. It's an arrangement where workers must join a union after being hired. Under this arrangement, workers do not have to belong to a union to be hired. And I think here, hold on. Let me just erase this so it doesn't make confusion. I think. Let's go. Okay. So, bona fide union shop. Okay, workers do not have to belong to a union to be hired, and the worker cannot be forced to join a union to keep their jobs. So there's a certain freedom here. If a worker voluntarily joins the union, okay, they can, but they must remain members as long as they have their jobs. So in a modified union shop, I have the choice. I can get hired, and my company cannot force me to be part of the union, but I have the choice. I can join the union, but if I join a union, I must remain in this union as long as I have my job. We also have an agency shop. It's where non-union members must pay union due. Okay? However, a worker is not required to join a union as a condition to keep their job. Okay, so remember, in the agency shop, a worker is not required to join a union, okay, as a condition to keep their job. However, if a worker joins, they must pay union due. This is one of the most famous ones now in the United States. Let's go. Last page. So today the United States has a population of about 320 million people. Half of the people belong to the civilian labor force. What is the civilian labor force? They are men and women, 16 years and older, who are either working or actively looking for a job. The civilian classification, it excludes the prison population, okay? So nowadays, I would tell you that we have how much? 1 in every 9 people who actually belongs to a union. I hope this lesson was pretty easy for you. I hope it helps you with your assignment. Okay, I don't know if you remember, but one of the assignments asked you to talk about the features that we have from the labor unions nowadays. You need to write sort of an essay about it, which is here. Okay, and which ones are not necessary anymore, or they shouldn't be enforced anymore. This was your question. Okay, thank you for being here with me. I hope that I recorded everything this time, and then you can hear my voice, and maybe next time I will start singing for you before I start. Okay, have a nice week. Bye.